Hello and welcome to Franklin Covey's C-Suite Conversations podcast. My name is Patrick Ledden, and each week I have the honor of sitting down and talking to a C-Suite executive to learn about their life, their work, and their career, what they've learned along the way, the struggles they've overcome, and the successes they've achieved, all with one end in mind: to share with you, our listeners, some insights or ideas that you can apply in your career, regardless of where you might be and your journey. Today, I'm joined by Heather Stefanski. Heather is partner and chief learning and talent officer at McKinsey. And in our conversation today, she shares with us what she's learned over the course of her career about how to be a successful individual contributor, leader, and executive, and what they do at McKinsey to grow people across that entire continuum. Trust me, regardless of what you do for work, you're going to want to grab something to write with, sit back, and take some notes as Heather and I talk today in C-Suite Conversations. Hey, Heather Stefanski, welcome to C-Suite Conversations.
Thank you for having me, Patrick.
Thanks for joining us. I'm excited about the conversation today. I think the listeners are going to learn a lot about not only just leading ourselves and choices we can make in our career, but really how you go about building effective cultures and maintaining those in organizations. If you wouldn't mind on the front end, just tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. Happy to, Patrick. So my background is I've actually got a sort of an array of degrees. I started with an undergrad in engineering and then went to business school and also got my master's in education. So I did a little bit of everything. I've been at McKinsey for my entire career. So I started at McKinsey as a business analyst, kind of in the consulting world, and really found that I had a real passion for people and people topics and solving people problems. So I went from sort of supporting our clients and helping them develop and grow on topics, and came internally and said, look, McKinsey is an amazing place developing the world's best talent. How can I kind of aid in that journey to develop sort of some of the world's best leaders? And I spent some time in recruiting. I've spent time in our professional development function, in our talent function, in our learning function. And I currently lead for McKinsey. I'm one of the leaders of the people function, and I oversee our learning and development function, our people data and analytics function, and also we call it the way we work, but it's really about sort of how can the science of teamwork, how can we make teams as effective as possible?
Now, I imagine that some people listening might know the name McKinsey, but they're probably Googling it if they're not that familiar with it. Can you give them a feeling of like, when you say the learning and development function, how big is that, or what's the size of that scope?
Yeah, absolutely. So McKinsey has about 45,000 employees around the globe, and we operate in 68 countries. And McKinsey is a general management consulting firm, which means we work with mostly Fortune 500 companies, but we also work with governments and nonprofits, and helping them both sort of solve some of their hardest business problems, but then sort of implement the changes that happen. And so we have within McKinsey kind of a range of colleagues, from folks that are, more generalists that kind of cut across lots of different topic areas, to sort of specialized experts in lean manufacturing and other topics, to sort of like technologists, data scientists, cloud engineers, sort of you name it, that all come together on teams to sort of support our clients. I would say the other unique thing about McKinsey is our average tenure at the firm is like 2.5 years. So it means we bring in a lot of people and we talk about accelerating your career. And so, we have this notion of kind of 1 year at McKinsey is like 5 years outside of McKinsey. And so it's a real challenge then for us to then think about how do you develop people in such a way that they might come in as an undergrad, and 2 years later they leave and they're able to be a product manager. And we're known for that, right? So if you look at Time Magazine has ranked us the #1 leadership factory, in terms of organizations. And, part of my role is ensuring that we're continuing to develop the world's best leaders.
Well, I spent the last 11 years as an undergraduate professor and led the business studies program at Vanderbilt University. So we have a lot of students who do just that. They come out of undergraduate and maybe go to a McKinsey or someone else. We won't name other firms at this point, but other firms that are kind of in this similar space. And you're right. They often tell me about the kind of the intensity, what they learn so quickly. They can get thrown into all sorts of environments, and then maybe they go on to school, additional schooling or whatever they choose to do next in their career. Do you have a lot of people who boomerang? Maybe they come through and then they come back later?
A lot of people that boomerang. I have personally hired folks into the firm that it's their third stint. So we have a lot of people that boomerang. It is a really intensive and supportive development experience that colleagues get a lot out of, and they often will get pulled in to go do some other opportunities where they build some sort of expertise, and then they sort of have even more value when they come back because they miss the sort of development culture that's part of McKinsey and the sort of the breadth of opportunities that it has to offer you.
I was looking at something the other day, and it was talking about historically how people would live out their life in regards to career, kind of, over the last several decades, where it was you had your education, and then you went to the workforce, and then you went to retirement. And how now it's a little bit more like you have your education, then you maybe do something in the workforce, then maybe you do something that's a little bit more leisure based, recreational based, or you take some time off, and then you do some education, then you come back into the workforce. And are you seeing that kind of move? Because you have your finger right at the pulse of a lot of people who are coming into McKinsey early on in their career and then throughout the career. Are you seeing that type of dynamic play out? And if so, what's that feel like or look like?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely are seeing that dynamic. And actually, McKinsey, in the environment that we operate in with its consulting projects versus you having a staffed role, actually facilitates and supports that. And so, even within the organization itself, we have secondment opportunities where you can go leave and come back. We have something called Take Time, where you can actually in a year take 3 to 4 months off and go off and do something and then come back. And so we actually encourage those kinds of developmental experiences and opportunities because we find folks richer when they come back and they've had some of these experiences at the firm. So yes, we're absolutely seeing it, and I would probably say we were more at the forefront of supporting it than anything else. I mean, McKinsey has always had a program where you come work for McKinsey, then we send you off and go get some education, and then you come back. That's kind of been a core part of our value proposition, and we enable that at different moments of colleagues' careers.
You often hear people talk about a war on talent or war for talent. Do you see that playing out? Because I know you're looking for some of the brightest minds.
Yeah, absolutely. We always have to be at our best, and we need not only need to be at our best in terms of how we're recruiting, but we need to deliver on that value proposition, right? And so I talked about this notion of McKinsey truly being a career accelerator and the best place for you to get development, and we got to deliver on that if we want to be able to win the war for talent. And our talent war has expanded, right? It used to be like we would compete with other consulting firms and investment banks. Now you've got much more tech, startups, private equity, venture capital. So there's a whole range of organizations that we are now kind of competing with for talent. We also find some of our talent is very mission and purpose driven, right? And so, nonprofits or other purpose driven organizations also have become more and more competitors of ours.
How have you seen that change over the course? Because your career has been there for many years. How have you seen that change and evolve as an organization? And also, why have you chosen to stay there for so long?
Yeah. So I think that the evolution that I would say we've seen is again, moving from competing, primarily for top talent with, let's say, investment banking and consulting firms into a much broader sort of range of roles that we're competing for talent, both because the talent is kind of being brought into organizations like the tech companies, startups, et cetera, are seeing sort of the real value of kind of junior talent and hiring in that top talent themselves. Even our clients, we see that as well, and the diversity of roles that we're now hiring for. So we tended to hire sort of smart people out of undergrad, out of PhD, out of MBA programs. When I started, I can still remember when we started to hire some doctors, and that was like, oh my goodness, we're hiring doctors now, into the firm. And since then, we've expanded and been hiring, data scientists and data engineers and cloud engineers and folks that are really steeped in transformation and implementation and a whole kind of a broader set of skills, which has made us sort of upped our game and the role that I have to play in helping to develop multiple types of talent in the firm to make them successful, and then broaden sort of the set of places that we have to compete with for that talent. And so that's been a journey that we've been on, for the past, 15, 20 years.
So I'd love if Heather.
And in terms of why I'm here and why I stay, yeah.
No, go ahead, please. I'm sorry. While you're here, yes.
Oh, I know you'd ask Patrick, and why am I still here? And I think that this is part of why I'm still here, because the challenges that we have in order to, retain and develop and accelerate the development of the best and the brightest, um, aren't staying static, right? It's a constant evolving set of challenges that we're facing in order to think about, what does it look like to be a career accelerator for somebody that, came out of Vanderbilt as an undergrad? What does it look like to be a career accelerator for, a data scientist that came out of MIT? What does that look like, and how do we deliver on that value proposition for all this different type of talent? So the two things that have kept me here are, one, like always interesting problems to solve in developing the world's best talent, and two, the set of people that I get to work with at McKinsey are just an incredible set of colleagues with really distinctive leadership experiences themselves, that push me, and I get to push them, and it's just awesome.
That is awesome. I bet you it's an amazing experience, no doubt. And you wouldn't stay there if it wasn't. So I would love to break this down, if we could, into three buckets, if we can. Just different listeners can kind of identify with different buckets based on where they might be in their own career and their own lives. The first one I want to ask you about around this talent piece is that the people who are maybe a little bit earlier on in their career. You mentioned yourself, your education itself was engineering and your master's in business and education as well. That's kind of interesting, that dynamic and play among those things. So maybe about somebody early on in their career, about learning new things and going in different directions and the value of that. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about somebody maybe mid-career, where how do they continue to stay somebody that's attractive for organizations to hire and keep and maintain. How can they kind of keep their skills up along the way? And then we'll talk about people in your type of role in executive suite, where it's a little bit like, how do we really attract and keep these people around? So if I can break it down in those three areas, I think that'd be really helpful for listeners to identify. Let's start off with that first one. People who are earlier on in their career, maybe they're studying in school, or they're just getting
Yeah.
going. I mean, what would you tell them about learning new things and kind of adapting and finding kind of who they are in that process?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's probably one theme like throughout all of those, which is being curious and always a learner. And I think that's relevant for people early in their careers. The other thing I would say is, like, I personally have children who are just starting in their careers, right? And there's this mentality that whatever decision I make is like the decision that's going to shape my career. I mean, Patrick, you described it earlier where you said, you went to undergrad, you made a decision on your job, and then you just stayed there. That's not the way the world works, right? Each of these decisions that you make is one of, 30, 40, 50, 60 decisions that will eventually shape your career, but none of them are decisions that are like you're stuck, right? So when I decided to, get a degree in engineering at Princeton, I thought maybe I would be an engineer. I actually tested that out. I went and worked, in like project management for a construction of building, actually the Cleveland Indian Stadium, now Guardians at the time, as an internship over the summer. I was like, well, that was interesting. And here's what I liked about it. I liked the ability to solve problems. That was really interesting to me, but I didn't really like the engineering thing. It's like, okay, that was like one decision, right? Then like another decision, I, went and spent a little time at Accenture, where I was solving problems in a consulting environment, but doing a lot of coding. And I was like, oh, well, I actually like the problem solving. I like this consulting thing, but I don't like this. And so you just sort of, you build over time, and you just decide to go do something, make the most out of it, learn, have impact, and then that will create the next thing that you want to try. And so again, you'll see I did a bunch of things, and it turns out that now in my career I get to use all of those things. So I guess I would encourage everybody to think about all the opportunities you have to learn, and getting the most out of those opportunities to learn, and not thinking that any one decision is going to sort of shape your career. The other thing I would say is, again, with my kids, it's like, it's not going to be perfect, right? Like the perfect job or the perfect opportunity or the perfect education is not going to be there. But what can I learn from this particular opportunity that I can then take forward that will help me build my career? So that's a little bit how I think about sort of that first phase of folks' careers. The second phase, and this is interesting for me as well, is sometimes that second phase of your career involves having young children. It involves, spouses, that are also having jobs in different places, etc. So one of the things I encourage people sort of in that middle stage of their career to think about is what's the, what's the race? Like, is there a race? Maybe there's not a race. I personally spent like 12 years as a manager during that time because I had, a husband who'd moved locations and I needed to go with him. I had small children. I wanted to work part-time. There was a bunch of stuff in that space where, I was just happy being a manager. But here's what I'll tell you is I remained curious. I was always taking on new projects and new things outside of the scope of like what was in my job box. And I was a manager, but I was a manager across the recruiting function, across our professional development function, across our learning function, across our talent function at the firm. And so that gave me this amazing platform to work off of. And so that would be the other thing I would sort of say to folks kind of in that middle spot in their career, which is the answer is not always up, right? And what are you racing for? And then if you kind of go to that end state, sort of as a C-suite, executive, kind of where I sit right now, I think some of those same things in terms of the learning and the curiosity are so critical. And particularly in the space that I'm operating right now in learning development, people, digital analytics, all these things are changing fast, right? And spending the time to engage with people outside of your organization, to me is a real priority to understand what's happening in the broader world around you. So I think that's kind of one of the things that I see really critical for the success of senior colleagues is this notion of, being externally oriented to understand what's going on. The second thing is being able to operate in sort of ambiguity, right? We don't exactly know how L&D is going to work 3 years from now. We know it's going to be different, but we don't know how it's going to work. So, how comfortable are you in sort of operating within ambiguity? And then the third thing is the ability to move fast when there's a clear direction. Because more and more, in order for us to support the needs of our business, and I view myself as helping the business to deliver on, their goals, those what the business needs are changing faster and faster than ever. So how are you able to mobilize resources very quickly in order to, kind of accelerate whatever it is? So I've recently worked on a couple of articles with a broad set of CLOs across Fortune 500 companies. And one of the things we're really talking about is this notion of a skills accelerator and what it takes now to truly mobilize to build a strategic capability for an organization. And it's being able to bring together kind of a cross-functional teams focused on a particular objective to achieve that. So it's like, how do you mobilize to move even more quickly, which often requires a set of relationships and partnerships across the business that you might or may not have in the past.
I so appreciate you walking us through that, each of those levels. I heard that piece as you were talking about early on, just going through the entire, it was a thread that you pulled through the entire discussion was around just continually being curious and learning and growing and developing in every role you're at. Specifically from the C-suite, who have you seen or how have you seen them get that right? Staying curious, staying connected. What have you seen senior leaders do to make sure that they kind of keep their head in the game and continue to grow and develop themselves?
Yeah, I think one of the bits is what I talked about, just having a bit of an external orientation, right? Where you're not just internally focused as an organization. So I think that makes a big difference. I think one of the other things is the willingness to be sort of humble and vulnerable and saying, I don't know, right? So, I have, colleagues on my team, right now where I was like, how does that LLM work? I don't know. Can you teach me? Right? And just sort of making yourself a little bit vulnerable to say that you don't know and that you want to learn, I think is another thing. A third thing I would say is just having some objectives around what you want to learn, right? One of the things that we talk about is we call it a 3 by 3 by 3, right? Who are the 3 people you want to learn from? What are those 3 things that you're going to try to learn over the next 3 months, right? And I think that's just a great way to sort of, have a view. I mean, right now we're trying to build some AI-based tools to help support, the development ecosystem. And I am actually like in there with the developers and I'm in there with our data scientists, like actually like seeing how the model works because I want to learn, right? And you would say like, Heather, like you have a ton of things you got to do as an executive. Like, why are you like hanging out with the developers on this one particular product of the whole ecosystem? It's because I want to learn. But I've sort of, again, set that as objective for me to learn. And who am I going to learn from? I'm going to learn from this tech lead and these data scientists. And so that's who I'm going to spend some real time with, because I want them to apprentice me, to teach me how to learn. And so that's what I would say is, at least in my view, some of the things to sort of help you stay curious, help you stay relevant, help you stay current, and that you can make sure that you're, always setting a big, bold aspiration in terms of where you want your organization to go.
It sounds so much like these are just things that we need to continually work on right from the get-go. Don't wait until you're way down your career path, if you will, to suddenly realize, I need to be a little bit more self-aware, or I need to be a little bit more humble, or I need to be a little bit more willing to say, I got that one wrong. I mean, these are good practices to get into. I think not only in work, but in life, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, in life, what you're trying to do is you're trying to build a set of skills, right? And you're developing over time. And we've done a ton of work at McKinsey on this concept of apprenticeship. Other people talk about the expert novice relationship and what makes an individual develop, again, this notion of accelerating your development. So how is you an individual accelerate your development? Well, there's actually a set of skills as a learner that you need to have, and there's a skills as a teachers that need to have to sort of build those relationships. And the thing that's interesting, if you're just the learner, if you demonstrate those behaviors, you make your teachers better. So another example of one of those behaviors is just asking the question why. You walk out of a meeting, and I've been presenting something to a bunch of senior leaders, and you just say, hey Heather, tell me a little bit about what you were thinking when you were making that presentation, right? Or you've written a storyline that you write something to me, a draft of an email, and I send it back to you with a bunch of corrections. Do you say why, Heather? Why did you make those corrections? So that's just an example of like a skill as a learner that helps you accelerate your development. We know that improves the relationship of a novice to become an expert, or this apprenticeship relationship. And so again, that's a thing that you can start very early in your career, and it'll take you all the way.
Well, some of the language I found as I was researching for our conversation was a lot around skills-focused development culture that you have. Could you put some more meat on the bone on that?
Yeah. So again, this notion of a development culture, we think about really development, which is how we develop the people, but we also hold a really high bar for performance, right? Most people at McKinsey are saying, that have come through will say, oh my gosh, in McKinsey, they have a bit of this up or out culture. It's really high intensity around performance. And we hold a really high bar. But we also think about development. And so what that means is we think about sort of our leadership development model. We think about both the outputs, which are like the impact that you had. So what kind of impact did you have at your client? What kind of impact did you have in leading your teams and developing others? What does that impact look like? What kind of impact did you have in building the firm? But we also look at this, that's sort of the output. We also look at the impact or the inputs. So what are the skills that are helping you develop to do that? So again, we think about the skills that are helping you develop and how do we accelerate the development of those skills? And we think about it from day one. So we have a set of, for example, you start at the firm, we're going to give you we call it a day one readiness assessment. Like, we know you need a set of communication skills to be ready day one. We know you need a set of problem solving skills. We know you need a set of Excel skills. We know you need a set of PowerPoint skills. How are you doing on those skills, and how are you going to develop them? And then over the course of your work, we have, we call it, engage, like feedback, project-based feedback that happens. And that's also skills-based. And it says, hey, here's the expectations for you as a, on sort of your listening skills or, your written communication skills. Here's the expectations, and here's how you're developing on that particular skill over time. Right. And so, again, in your reviews, you might be kind of much more focused on what is the output, but there's all this development that's happening along the way that's really skills based in terms of how you develop those skills, which are going to make you better at driving that impact. So I don't know, Patrick, if that helps.
No, it does. I actually was reading an article that you wrote around feedback, and I think this plays a lot into this, especially when it's a skill to be able to give feedback and to do it well. And you talked about in the article about how feedback takes courage and it takes commitment and it takes time. I mean, how valuable do you see feedback being, and what have you learned are some of the kind of the essentials to doing it well?
Yeah. So again, like, if you talk about growth and development of people, people will say, hey, you run learning, you at the firm, like, so tell me about your learning programs and how those develop people. I say, I can tell you about my learning programs. They do some to develop people, but let me really tell you what happens on the team, like in the team.
Mm-hmm.
And so this notion of, I talked about, we really have the science of teamwork, where we've done a ton of work to understand sort of what are the rituals or practices within a team that actually make a difference on team performance. And we can both tie it to the performance of the team, we can tie it to the satisfaction of the individuals, and we can also tie it to client impact. And a core part of those rituals is feedback, right? So we have this ritual we call it one-on-one, right? What is the one-on-one? The one-on-one is where you're sitting down and having a conversation and giving each other direct and honest feedback, right? We also have a ritual that's called the kind of closeout. You sort of end the project. What do you do as a part of that end of the project? We give each other feedback on that project. That's a core part. We give each other feedback. We get feedback from our clients. There's a whole feedback ritual associated with it. And when you kick off a project, we have a kickoff ritual. And as a part of that kickoff ritual, you talk about what are the development goals and what am I hoping to get feedback on? Because one of the other things we know about the science of feedback is if I ask you, Patrick, for feedback, my mental model is actually going to be more receptive to receiving it, and you're going to feel more comfortable in actually giving it to me, right? So if we could start off every project or piece of work where people are saying, hey, Patrick, I want feedback on how well I'm doing on this whole podcast thing, because that's not a core part of what I do. Then, I will be more receptive to it, and you will be more willing to give it to me over time. So we sort of start with, what are the things you really want feedback on? We have a set of rituals ongoing, this one-on-ones to provide each other feedback. And then we have a closeout ritual where we sort of summarize the full engagement in terms of, lots of different feedback, upward feedback, so it's a core part of the rituals of how we work at McKinsey.
I want to dive a little bit further into feedback, because I think if I was to give feedback some feedback, I'd be like, well, feedback, you're getting kind of a bum rap out here a lot, because people don't necessarily do it well. They don't put the time into it. They don't prepare for it. Sometimes it's less about the person who's receiving the feedback and their overall development, and more about the idiosyncrasies of the person giving the feedback. Like, this is just how you have to do to work with me, type of thing. Sometimes it feels like even a top performer will get a note saying, let's have a feedback session, and immediately they're like, oh gosh, I'm in trouble, or what's going to happen. I mean, what does it take in your mind? And you went through many of those, but kind of at the highest of levels, what does it take to make feedback actually work organizationally, so that people do embrace it, that people are willing to say, here's some things I want to have feedback on, and they're not kind of, hedging their bets, that they know they're picking things that they're going to do okay in, so it won't be an uncomfortable conversation.
Yeah. Well, I think, it goes back to some of the things we talked about at the beginning, right? This notion of everybody's got to come in with curiosity and desire to learn, right? And that's a huge part of, again, McKinsey. If you want to develop and accelerate your development, we've got to have it normalized in the culture that means a lot of feedback. I mean, I can still remember, my first days at the firm, where everything I would do, I would come back, and back in the day, it was all paper. So it would just come back with red marks all over it, right? And I couldn't take that personally as an attack on me. I took that as, hey, I'm curious. I want to learn. I want to get better. So I want to develop. So there's part of this, the mindset of the feedback receiver, to put themselves in a place where they can get curious, right? Curious about whatever it is, even if you think, that's not the best feedback, but can you get yourself curious, right? And so that's like one of the things. The other thing is then, with a feedback giver, you're right, Patrick, it's sometimes tough. It's tough to provide that honest and direct feedback, and to really make it actionable, right? Because if you're just providing me feedback and saying, Heather, you did a crap job on that podcast, what am I going to do about that? Versus you saying, Heather, there are 3 things that I observed that would really make you better at giving podcast. You could talk slower, so they're actually real specific actionable recommendations, which by the way, also takes a little bit of the personal nature away from it, right? Because you're now talking about the specific action versus it's like a Heather, you're crappy at doing podcast kind of experience. And so those are some of the other things. And I think um, the other thing is it sort of starts at the top, right? So we've had some really great examples where some of the senior leaders of our different offices have gotten up in front of the entire office and read their feedback, right? And had their evaluator sort of read their feedback to them. And they talked about sort of how they were going to, and they sort of had that feedback conversation live and upfront. And sort of just the role modeling of the importance of those feedback conversations. And then I guess the last thing I would say is feedback is a skill. And so if your organization isn't doing anything to upskill people on the skills of giving, and by the way, also receiving feedback, because we tend to focus on the giver and the receiver is just as important, you're never going to be able to sort of build that culture of feedback because people don't have the right tools and skills to do it.
I was thinking as you were saying that, I was going back on my own experience, and from an N of one, from my own experience, I worked at KPMG for a number of years, and at this point, it was a partnership type of model. So it was very like imagine a floor of an office building, and there were four corners, and each corner had a partner in it. And I was on one
Mm-hmm.
partner's team, and some of my colleagues were on another's partner's team. And they could have both consultants could have received a paper that they wrote marked up all in red, but the one side, it was literally like it was a ton of bricks being dumped on top of you, and you just knew it was going to be a really bad experience. And it was all really stemming from that partner in that corner office and how how he treated everyone any given day. And then you go to the other side, and that same type of feedback could be given to someone, and they'd receive it completely different. It just says that the tone of that person in that position, in that role, and how they're building the culture is so critical. I just could see it every day. I had some friends who just wouldn't want to go to the monthly meeting with the partner to share their project with the client, even if it tripled in revenue that month, because the partner was still going to berate them in the process. And it's so critical that leader can set that tone.
Absolutely, absolutely. Like one of the things I tell, leaders when they ask me, like, what can you do? You can like say, this is what I'm getting feedback on. Here's what I've heard, right? Like just that sort of ability to be you yourself a learner and you yourself open to feedback and responding to it in a productive way kind of sets the tone for the entire team that you're working with.
That's such a great point. Well, as we wrap up our conversation, and we've hit a lot on this, so I'm going to see what else whether great insight you have, because I bet there's so many we could talk for hours. But I always ask at the end, regardless of where somebody's at in their career, whether they're early on in their career, they're midway along, they're in the executive suite, whatever it might be, what piece of advice do you think would be helpful to them as they think about the next step in their journey? And I know we talked about learning and development, we've talked about feedback or learning and growth, and we've talked about feedback. We've talked a bit about curiosity, but if there was something else you could add to that quiver of arrows, what would you say to them? Hey, this is something as you progress forward, you should continue to work on.
The other thing I would say is just have an impact orientation, right? So, what is the impact you're driving? How does that impact tie to the broader business outcomes, right? Sometimes we get really stuck in, I would call it like an activity orientation. Like, I did this activity, I did that activity, I did this activity, I did that activity. To say, like, okay, let's move yourself from like a activity and orientation to an impact orientation. And the really amazing thing these days is we have so much more data at our disposal. And because we have that data, you can actually start to measure impact. And so as you're thinking about, kind of going into your, next review cycle or a conversation with your manager about, hey, look, I think I'm ready for promotion. Can you move that conversation from like, here's the 6 activities I did to here's the impact I drove and how it's connected to sort of the broader aspirations of the organization. So that would be one other thing I would say has always served me in my career is to have this kind of impact orientation.
That's beautiful. I can tell you from an impact perspective, you had quite an impact today. I think that the listeners have so many nuggets of information that they can take away from this and apply not only today, but also just throughout their career. And I'm just so thankful to you for joining us today, Heather, and sharing your insight and your expertise and a bit about both about your journey individually as well as McKinsey's journey organizationally. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Patrick. Really enjoyed it.
Well, folks, that's all I have for today's episode. Big thanks to Heather Stefanski for joining me in C-Suite Conversations to share her insights and ideas from a career at McKinsey. That's all I have for today. Thanks so much for joining me. Now go make it a great day.